He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
They say life is stranger than fiction.
It's incredible, isn't it? This ability for a material to self-heal. It's the holy grail and something that scientists would ultimately like to be able to do.
But sometimes what we see in movies or read in books is so incredible that it obviously couldn't be possible. Or could it?
But they're making them on the nanoscale. So they're making tiny particles, which they layer on top of each other, that become incredibly strong.
Welcome to Sci-fi Sci-Fact with me, Brian Crumb. Every week a scientist from New Zealand's McDiarmid Institute explains the facts behind the fiction. In this episode, we suit up with Dr. Catherine Whitby, Senior Lecturer in Chemistry at Massey University and McDiarmid Institute Associate Investigator, and find out how realistic Ironman suit, the titular character's futuristic exoskeleton, really is.
Okay, let's do this right. Start mark half a meter and back to center. Dummy, look alive. You're on standby for fire safety. You, roll it. Okay. Activate hand controls. We're going to start up nice and easy. You're going to see 10% thrust capacity, achieve lift. And 3, 2, 1.
Iron Man first put on the magic suit, back in 1968, according to the Marvel comic world?
That's right, yeah. And it's an amazing kind of thing to put on, right? It's this mechanized suit of armor that gives him superhuman strength. It's durable. And, it's even got weapons as well. What more could you want?
Yeah, well, it turns Tony Stark, who's the regular guy, right? Before Tony becomes the Iron Man, from just a regular guy with a huge ego. Okay, although that might depend. See, I know Iron Man from the movies. And who plays it? Who plays him in the movies? Robert Downey Jr.? Yeah.
That's him, yeah.
That's right. He plays him with a very big ego. But now with Iron Man's suit, he's got a body to match his super ego, which makes him even more annoying in a way.
Exactly.
But that is perhaps part of the charm of Iron Man, if it does indeed have charm. But, not only does it allow him to withstand bullets and fly in the sky properly at supersonic speeds and shoot bullets himself, and this is the deal breaker for a bloke like me who can't sew, the suit mends itself. Am I right?
It's incredible, isn't it? This ability for a material to self-heal. It's the holy grail and something that scientists would ultimately like to be able to do. But yeah, that suit that can effectively, and the other thing that I really love is the fact that he just kind of touches a button or makes a move and the suit starts growing around him. That's incredible.
Yeah, no mucking around in the changing rooms,
No hopping into a phone booth or something like that, Hang on, people,
no
just
spinning
hop,
around
stop
and
while I
around
put
with a
the suit
flash.
on.
None of that. Just push a button, instant superhero. That's the way.
Absolutely. That's what you want, right?
Okay, now this sounds like a long way from reality to me. And this is where your work comes in. What exists in real life that in any way matches what Mr. Stark does with his suit?
Well, one of the big or really interesting features of this suit is that it's kind of like a shell that's got this incredible strength and this ability to protect Tony from all sorts of situations. And we're actually starting to try and imitate these kinds of shells, which already form in nature. So this idea of using a hard covering or a shell to support and protect a human body probably came from the shells that we see in nature. Animals like clams and oysters, even things like snails, they have that sort of shell on their outside that protects them from the external world. It can have lots of other really interesting functions as well. But it's kind of like an external skeleton rather than the internal skeleton like you and I have.
Turtles and tortoises, is that shell regarded as an exoskeleton as well?
Yes, and in fact, they have, or some of them have, both an internal and an external skeleton. So they're really interesting creatures.
Now, on one level, that sounds like it does protect you. But there's one thing that a lot of those things have in common, and which is maybe a bit of a problem for Ironman. None of those things move very fast, as far as I know. Is that one of the compromises you have to make? If you build this shell that protects you from attack from the outside, or maybe just the weather outside, heat or cold or whatever, then you can't move very fast?
I reckon it probably depends. You see, the advantage that Iron Man has in his shell is that his armor is also mechanized. So it has motors in there that get him moving around. Whereas for the animals, their big focus is on making this covering that protects them. And they don't have little motors to put in them to move them around. They haven't needed to do that. But it is ultimately a feature that you can imagine human beings would want to do. There are movies, we see futuristic movies where people put on a suit and then they're able to lift huge weights and things like that. So ultimately, that's what you'd want to be able to do.
Okay, I might come back to that later on. But just moving on to another thing the Iron Man suit does, mending itself. Now, this could be something which nature does because, basically all those living creatures have to make the shell themselves, don't they? Nobody else makes it, apart from a hermit crab, of course.
I mean, these creatures, something like a sea snail, for example, builds its own shell from scratch. And this is one of the creatures that keeps growing and getting bigger, and it has to keep kind of extending and expanding its shell so it can fit inside it. So that self-healing capability is a really interesting feature and function of this kind of material.
Getting back to moving around at speed, however, don't some insects have an exoskeleton as well? And they
You're
maybe,
right.
in terms of relative to their size, do move quite quickly. Can you think of some examples?
Let's see. What about things like grasshoppers and the like?
Yeah, they can move.
Exactly. Yeah, they got real springs in their feet, haven't they?
And don't fleas have an exoskeleton? I'm not sure, but I do know it's a pretty hard to crush a flea, and I'm guessing that's because they've got a hard shell on the outside. And,
It could be.
And a flea relative to its size can also move a hell of a lot. You try catching one of those fleas.
That's right. Yeah. No, look, you're right. They do have very strong exoskeletons that make them very hard to crush, and they're also able to leap out of danger really quickly. So when those fleas jump off your cat and you're trying to chase them around, that's how they get away from them fast.
Once they're living, can they actually repair those shells?
Yes, in some cases, some animals can repair their shells. In other cases, what happens is an animal might have to possibly shed its shell and then try and grow a fresh one. And other animals, once the shell is really badly damaged, I think unfortunately that's it.
This is another problem here. See, the name Iron Man suggests that there's a fair amount of steel or iron in the suit. But shells are made of calcium carbonate, aren't they, on the whole?
You're right. They're mainly calcium carbonate. And it's really weird when you think about it because calcium carbonate is chalk, isn't it? And that we're quite familiar with as quite a soft material. You can write on it with chalkboards and the like. And yet somehow these animals have transformed a material that appears to us to be very soft and malleable into a material that's very hard and durable.
What's the difference in the recipe?
The difference is in how these animals precipitate or form the particles of calcium carbonate and how they kind of layer them together. So, you know how in a brick wall, it's made of lots of bricks that are piled or organized into these layers on top of each other and packed together in a really clever pattern to make walls nice and sturdy. And they have in between those bricks a kind of a cement that holds the bricks together and adds extra strength to that structure. Well, a lot of these animals are kind of making brick walls, but they're making them on the nanoscale. So they're making tiny particles of calcium carbonate, tiny flat particles, which they layer on top of each other into these layered structures that are become incredibly strong.
And what are they sticking the particles of or the molecules of calcium carbonate together with? Is there any other molecule that gets involved?
You're right, there is. So these shells are really interesting. They're not just pure calcium carbonate. They're made maybe 95 to 99% calcium carbonate, but there's a tiny percent of proteins and carbohydrates, things called chitin. And these are sticky molecules that form like the glue in between those flat plates of calcium carbonate and hold them together nice and tight to form that tightly packed layer.
Has anyone tried to mimic this in a lab? And because what I'm getting at here is that suit can mend itself. And in order to mend itself in a useful time frame, it's going to have to do it pretty quickly. Otherwise, too bad for Ironman. The bad guys arrived and Ironman was undressed, so to speak.
Exactly.
Had his pants down, had his suit around his ankles, and that's no good. So what is there anything that can make speed this process of making the shell up?
People have been looking, actually, for several years now. Scientists have been trying to mimic this process of biomineralization, this shell-making process in the lab. And about a few years ago now, there was a professor at the McDermott Institute in Wellington. Her name's Kate McGrath. And she actually developed a process that's kind of mimics the natural process used by animals like sea snails to make their shells. And the beauty of this process is that it's very flexible and versatile. And since then, people have gone on, they've done extra things to this process, and actually they're now getting towards being able to make materials that might start to approach becoming self-repairing.
How much success have they had?
Well, it's pretty early days on the self-repairing, but we're already having a lot of success on mimicking biomineralization in the lab. So what Kate realized was that what she ultimately the problem she needed to solve was when we try to make calcium carbonate, it tends to precipitate out of solution in the form of these big lumps, which are difficult to kind of pack together into that layered structure that you need to form this tightly packed shell. And it occurred to her a hydrogel or a gel would be a way of trying to control and direct how the calcium carbonate precipitates out of solution.
Right. Does this mean you would apply the gel to the shell you're trying to mend?
Yes, exactly. And indeed, that's the idea that some scientists have had. They're trying to use these gels almost as dressings for wounds and the like, as materials that you could apply where there's been an injury or there's a hole. And if within them, they can then direct the growth of those calcium carbonate crystals into a structure that kind of fills that hole and binds that up, then that indeed could be one way of repairing damage.
Right. So a couple of things come to mind here. One is that could you use this technique to mend broken bones?
Actually, you could. So people have taken variations of it and are looking into things like tissue regeneration or growing bones and the like, definitely.
Getting back to the Ironman suit. Mm-hmm. So say the Ironman takes a bit of a blow and the suit's got a crack and the next blow will blow it apart. So he's got to get it. You've got to mend it. It's got to mend itself. So say he did put a gel on. Will the gel be able to reorganize the molecules of chitin? Is it chitin or chitin?
Chitin.
Chitin. Neither. Chitin. Right. Not. I like that Freudian slip there. The chitin and the calcium carbonate, will it just reorganize those molecules to form a strong bond again?
It can do, depending on the types of proteins that you've got in there. You can, one of the things that Kate discovered and other people have found as well, that the choice of protein can direct the structure and shape of the calcium carbonate crystals that form. And similar applications, or there is similar approaches can be used in methods that biomineralize or form other kinds of materials in similar kinds of gels.
The reason I ask this is, say, and this is a different problem, say Ironman has a hole in his suit. Now there's actually some calcium carbonate and chitin that's disappeared. Surely at that point you've got to get some more raw material. Nothing comes from nothing, right?
You're right. I mean, animals like sea snails that are making their shells, they suck up the calcium and the carbonate that they need from their local environment. So there's calcium ions, there's carbonate ions, there's lots of ions in the water that they can actually, the sea snail sort of sucks in and then recycles to form and uses to make its shell. So that is a little bit of a weakness of the idea that we've come up with.
I mean, if you could absorb what you needed from the atmosphere, from the air, you can probably get your carbon that you might need from the air. But I don't know about the calcium. And what's chitin made of? Carbohydrates. So again, you might be struggling to get carbohydrates from the air as well.
Yes.
Not some of the ingredients for carbohydrates, but not all of them.
That's right. And the sea snails generally, these animals generally provide the proteins and the carbohydrates, but it's the ingredients for the mineral that's part of this biomineral that they take from their environment. But, you know, there are probably opportunities. So, for example, snails on land, well, they pick up ions like carbonate from the soil. So we might have to think about where we could source these raw materials from. But this biomineralization process, compared to some of the other routes that we use to make these materials, it's got lots of advantages. So often if we in the real world want to make some of these minerals, we have to make these materials using high pressures and temperatures, really aggressive sorts of conditions. Meanwhile, animals like sea snails and the like, they're making calcium carbonate under much milder conditions. So we've still got work to do to figure out how to make materials much more sustainably. And that's really a function of that's one of the big goals of the McDermott Institute, is to find ways of making materials in a fashion that's almost circular. So we use materials that are already made or have already been produced, and we recycle and reuse them, kind of like a circular economy.
But from what you're saying, Catherine, Ironman has been misnamed. Ironman should be Chalk and Chitin Man, right?
He should be in the real world.
Could you do any of this stuff that we've just talked about with steel?
That's a really good question. Not that I'm aware of, no. The biomineralization that I'm familiar with is really about making these inorganic solids, not metallic materials. So it's a different kind of material that we're talking about here.
So if we accept then that Ironman is probably off beam, but Chalk and Chitin Man could be something that could happen in real life, or woman for that matter. One of the issues with shells is that they can get brittle and also that weight thing. So do you think you could create a suit that then is able to, also give you flexibility when you're flying around there and in space or wherever you might be, just flying around, I guess, generally, because he doesn't have a oxygen tank on his back as far as I know. He's just got a fuel tank to blast him around. Could you do that with something made of a shell that's made of chitin and calcium carbonate?
I reckon you could. So, for example, different shells of animals, like things like lobster claws, are incredibly tough and hard to maneuver, whereas other kinds of shells with different ratios of calcium carbonate and proteins and carbohydrates have different degrees of flexibility. What you might have to do also is have a system where you have plates of the calcium carbonate. So it's not a completely one whole continuous shell, but you've got plates of the stuff, and in between the plates, you have material that allows some flexibility so that the plates can be bent around shapes.
Almost like scales, perhaps, and that would maybe give you the flexibility to be able to do all the arm and leg movement or whatever that he does when he's flying around or when he's firing a gun or whatever he's doing.
Exactly, yes. I mean, there's, it's incredible what nature can do, the materials that it makes, that we are only slowly learning and figuring out how to mimic in the real world.
Sci-Fi Sci-Fact is hosted by me, Brian Crump, and produced by Andrew Robertson. It's made possible with the enterprise of the brilliant minds at the McDiarmid Institute. You should be able to find the podcast on any podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. It's also available on the RNZ website, rnz.co.nz. Thanks for listening.